Fantastic. So assuming that everyone can now hear us online, you've been saved the long version of my introduction. Chris Ballard introducing Christophe Sand, who will be talking to us today about the question of depopulation across the Pacific, and hopefully also introducing his book, which is in press on this topic. Christophe, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. I would first like to thank the organizers of Synapse for making me come from Sydney to Canberra, and very much appreciated. So the topic today is really one that is about a question that everybody basically has in mind, talks about it here and there, but in the real run, I have been surprised how little there is in the literature which really tries to get into the depth of it. So I'm not a demographer. So I have in my field of expertise, which is New Caledonia, when I started doing field work over 30 years ago, I immediately realized that I had a real major discrepancy between what the ethnography and classic orthodox demography was saying about the few Kanaks that were there in 1774 when James Cook arrived, and a huge amount of archaeological sites that I could see in the bush in places where there was no one 10 or 20 kilometers around. So I have at that time really tackled the problem just saying we have a problem without going any further. But it seems at the end of my career that I'm now fit enough and free enough to really get back to the question. And my presentation will be fairly classic because I didn't know who the audience would be. And I thought it was important first to give a kind of short history of what contact period demography has been about in the Pacific before getting to a series of case studies, and then getting to an analysis of the key questions that I had in my title about when does it start, what is the size of it, and what were some of the consequences to the overall depopulation. First, about history of this around this topic. I have put these 4 graphs that come from the studies of Norma McArthur, just to give you an idea of how diverse things at first look at. Some places you got sharp situation really down, other ones you go up, other ones you go down, other ones you go flat, and you will see that my conclusions are really, it's not only my conclusions, but the conclusions that we can reach today are probably much more kind of one way. I start with what the first Europeans saw when they arrived in the Pacific. This is first of what the first supposed arrival of British in Tahiti was. From the shore side, 1, 2, and 3 miles back, there is a fine level country that appears to be all laid out in plantation, and the regular built houses seem to be without numbers all along the coast. This appears to be the most populous country I ever saw. The whole shore side was lined with men, women, and children all the way that we sailed along. This text is not only saying that you have heaps of people on the coast looking at the boats, at the ship, but it's also saying that it was covered with houses and plantations everywhere. The first general calculation was done a couple of years later by Foster, who said, at a moderate computation of 120,000 persons in the two peninsulas of Tahiti. This is the late 18th century. At the very end of that century, you have the first missionaries arrive. And the missionaries immediately say, well, everything that Cook and all the others have written doesn't fit what we are seeing. So clearly, these first writings were greatly exaggerated. The number of inhabitants of Bones Peninsula is about 50,000. So the cutting in just less than 30 years is already something like more than half. And what is interesting is that everywhere in the Pacific, when you start getting teachers and missionaries arriving, immediately you have writings of these missionaries saying there are epidemics. And the first reaction of the Pacific Islanders to these missionaries arriving and the connection with epidemics is to say, well, if we get rid of the missionaries or of the teachers, the epidemics might stop. The second half of the 19th century is one where in the Eastern Pacific, the depopulation slows down and you have the curve starts growing up, but it's the moment where you start having the first detailed accounts for island Melanesia. And these accounts are really terrible. I mean, people just disappear in a very short time. Europeans just, you will see a couple of examples. Europeans from the Bismarck archipelago all the way down to New Caledonia, right off, disappearing villages and disappearing groups with this idea that native population will in another 20 years have almost died out. So there is this, at the beginning of the 20th century, this idea that basically Melanesians are going to be wiped out. This fatal impact hypothesis is taken over seriously by a demographer, Norma McArthur, from this university in the 60s. And she gets back to the data. She wants to make the study of Pacific demography and depopulation kind of a scientific theme. And basically what she comes up to is that all what has been written before has not been rooted into data. And she said, for example, the widespread belief in the decrease of the Samoan population following European discovery and settlement was probably inspired by the lamentable and woeful decreases in Tahiti and the Cook Islands. Her conclusion, in one of her important case study, which is Tahiti, is that the population of Tahiti in 1769 could scarcely have been more than 35,000 persons, and it may have been smaller than this. So when you got from Foster, 120,000, and you reach 30,000 something, I mean, the decrease of the evaluation of the population at first contact is really immense. But the influence of McArthur was, when you look at it, really interesting, because she acknowledged very clearly that in some islands, depopulation was severe. And she acknowledged that diseases were a central part of the problem. One of her case studies was Rarotonga, where you had about 85% of population drop. And she acknowledged that in some cases that she considered quite few, you had a severe depopulation. But in numerous other cases, she felt that the data she had showed little variation. And for example, for Samoa, her idea is that there is little reason to think that the Samoan population in the first half of the 19th century was even much larger than at the century's close. So what she came up with was that in a number of islands, basically you had fairly little depopulation after contact, and that this was the main model or the main structure of depopulation in the Pacific. Her influence was immense. From the 70s up to the 1990s, nearly all historic demographers working on the Pacific followed the model of Norma McArthur, with the idea that population had dropped in some places, but in most of the places fairly little. And I've taken this book by Cliff and colleagues, published in 2000, where they have a whole chapter on the Pacific, which is really interesting because it gives the kind of vision that the demographers worldwide had about Pacific depopulation in relation to the work of Norma McArthur. What do we see? We see that in some places depopulation was severe. 42% in French Polynesia, even if I'm not sure what French Polynesian means in terms of what they're saying. Cook Islands, 28%. Fiji, 11% depopulation, but you see Samoa and Tonga, you have a gain in population during the 19th century. Immediately when Norma McArthur published her data, the end of the 1960s, you had some archaeologists, especially in Western Polynesia, who came up with disagreements and challenged her interpretation, basically saying that the amount of data that was present on these islands in terms of household, agricultural remains, platforms, etc., clearly showed that there would have been more people than what Norma McArthur was saying at a point in time. And so, for example, Roger Green in 1973 reckons that during the first half of the 19th century on Tonga Tapu, you probably had a loss of 50% of the population. Janet Davidson comes up with the same kind of conclusion after huge work on settlement patterns with Roger Green on Western Samoa in the 1960s. To open just a small window, the publication of the paper by Roger Green in 1973 got historical demographers completely crazy. I mean, a real huge arguments, to a point that Roger Green had prepared the same kind of paper for Samoa at that time. And he, in the end, published that paper in 2007. So he withdrew the paper for nearly, 40 years? So riff was the argument. But there was also debate between historical demographers starting at the end of the 1980s with a very challenging book by David Stannard on Hawaii. And David Stannard concluding that Hawaii at Cook's contact had probably between 800,000 and 1 million inhabitants. Historical demographers like Jean-Louis Ralu the French demographer, has recently published a series of papers raising exponentially the possibility of the number of inhabitants in Tahiti, proposing around 150,000, which is even more than Foster evaluated. But what is interesting is that even in large islands or archipelagos like New Zealand, you have today historical demographers who come to criticize the accepted wisdom in New Zealand history, considering that 80,000 to 100 Maori at Cook's contact has no robust evidence in their favor. Existing contact era Maori population estimates and associated ranges are indeed New Zealand numbers from nearly nowhere. This is the state of play at the beginning of the 20th century. So what I have done, thanks to COVID, is getting back a bit like Norma McArthur did, but as an archaeologist, getting back to publications of European sailors, matching that with a little bit of archaeology and seeing if in the 21st century we could kind of get another vision. And so the first examples will be quite iconic, starting with a case which is not really discussed because everybody agrees, which is the Marquesas Islands, considering that you have probably something around 95% of depopulation between the arrival or the contact with James Cook and the early 20th century. The Marquesas Islands are interesting because the southern part of the archipelago was visited in 1595 by Mendana and his crew. And so the question is this the upper limit, or do we have something else somewhere around here? I go from an archipelago down to a small island in the south of the Australs, Rapa Iti. For one simple reason, Rapa Iti is known for all his terraced and 45 top hills in terms of the archaeology. Rapa Iti is an interesting case because anthropologist Gazarian from Switzerland has published in a book basically every single letter, writing, notes that has been written on that island from first observation by Vancouver at the end of the 18th century to the mid-20th century. So it's an interesting case of just having all the data in just one book. So you can follow what happened on a kind of nearly year-to-year basis. And what does it bring? It brings, in 76 years, a depopulation around 95%, without ever having a French military coming, without ever having some sort of European invasion of the land, without ever having kind of colonial turmoil related to this depopulation. And so what we have here is an example of an isolated island, which should have been kind of partly protected because you didn't have a lot of boats coming, but which shows a catastrophic depopulation very quickly on. Tahiti is an interesting case. I had tackled about it early on, but evidently the few texts that we have of first contact in 1767 clearly mark a landscape which is covered with habitations. And when the British go inland, I mean, they go up to the end of the valley and it's covered with habitation, planting ground, plantation, and they see at the real top of the valley, that you still have people there and you have smoke, etc. The interesting case is that Gore, Lieutenant Gore, who was in Tahiti in 1767, is also with Cook 2 years later. So he wants to go back to the places where he had been, and especially to the Arioi Purea compound. And when he arrives there, everybody's gone. The houses have disappeared. The canoes are not on the beach anymore, etc. And Cook writes down, no, that is Banks, but Cook has the same, saying, well, the ship which visited the island about 17 months before us, which is probably Bougainville, brought with it a venereal disease, and that in the most virulent degree. These people have often described to me in most pathetic terms the shocking symptoms with which the poor wretches were afflicted. Their hair and nails dropped off, and their very fresh flesh rotted from their bones, so that they died miserable objects, stunned by their nearest relation, fearful lest they themselves might be tainted with the dreadful contagion. Here we are just 2 years after first contact. And contrary to what Norman McArthur thought, clearly things have started to change. And making a simple list of what you have between first contact at the end and the end of the 18th century, you have Wallace first contact introduces gonorrhea, Bougainville syphilis and maybe plague, Cook influenza, the Spanish have a cough, respiratory disease, plus tuberculosis, that's Cook. Rodriguez, the first 1 year settlement of Spanish to try to convert the people, probably cholera, and Vancouver dysentery. So by the end of the 18th century, even if you don't have a huge amount of boats coming, you basically have nearly all the major diseases already present in that population. No surprise then, if you had previous episode of diseases in the late 18th century, that at the beginning of the 19th century, what the missionaries see is an island which is partly already depopulated, leading to the point where the LMS missionaries end up by saying, oh, probably less than 20,000 people in the two peninsulas. Even McArthur felt that Tahiti was kind of a problem, ending up saying that conflicting versions of the numbers recorded in the few counts made before the end of the 19th century suggest that these were not particularly reliable. This is how we end. That's the orthodox view. This is the low point of historical demographer Ralu today. And in one of his last papers, he goes up to 180,000 inhabitants in Tahiti, which probably I would not buy, I must say. Hawaii is another case, because what Cook says on arriving is, in the course of our voyages, we had nowhere seen such vast numbers of people assembled at one place, with the classic quoting of hundreds were swimming about the ships like shoals of fish. Cook comes twice with a 9 month separation to Hawaii. And when he comes back in 1779, what he noticed is we found the venereal disease running amongst these poor people in a violent degree, some of whom were infected most terribly. And it was the opinion of most that we, in our former visit, had been the cause of this irreparable injury. This doesn't really help, but here is the number of proposals of population for Hawaii at first contact. You see that anthropologists like Peter Buck range around 100,000 to 150,000, Norman McArthur around 100,000, but David Stannard and demographer Dave Swanson reach between 680,000 and over 800,000. So you have a difference from 1 to 8, which is absolutely huge. What is interesting is that I remember when the book of Stannard came out, most archaeologists didn't really believe in it. People were ready to go to 300,000, 400,000. You look at the papers from Pat Cooch, for example. But the more it goes, the more the field studies in archaeology are getting closer and closer to Stannard's points over the last decades, which should probably give us a stand for the rest of the Pacific. When we turn to Tonga, basically it's even worse. Cook and his crew sees at one point during a ceremonial feast 12,000 people assembled in just one area. And oral tradition recount that after Cook's visit, a destructive epidemic broke up. The only symptom now recorded was a severe headache resulting in death after a few days' illness. The problem is that for the moment, we don't know if we have to remain little or severe in terms of depopulation for a place like Tonga. The orthodox view is that one. But work, especially now with LiDAR, will certainly bring back the question to a new set of arguments and numbers. And I think one a student is working on that right now. I don't want to multiply the number of cases. Just remind you that Micronesia is the same. You've got severe population drop, and here you've got examples between they all function in the same chronology, and you see that depending on where you are and the data we have at hand, everywhere you have indication of severe depopulation. The place where supposedly depopulation is least is Melanesia. One of the reasons being that people think that in the Pacific, the most severe depopulation occurred on islands which were farthest from the Asian landmass. In the Eastern Pacific, depopulation was less marked on the islands of the Western Pacific. And then there is this idea overall that lower population density and its dispersion has limited the importance of diseases. Fiji is a really good counterexample because depopulation was so rife during the second half of the 19th century that colonial Britain did put an inquiry at the end of the 19th century, collecting all the oral traditions about depopulation and demonstrating that from very first contact you had epidemics starting. So we have for Fiji a really interesting case where first contact was really late compared to the rest of the region. But Fiji is really interesting because we have this interest at the end of the 19th century of the colonial power to try to understand what is going on and when it did start. And again, it shows that the depopulation is at minimum something around 80-something%. This is a very conservative calculation by an archaeologist. The other point which is interesting for Fiji is that I think it's the only place apart from Hawaii where some archaeologists have tried to measure depopulation in the field by studying households, showing that between the contact period and the mid-19th century, you can identify a loss of probably something like 50% of household occupations. You've got here a kind of archaeological signature demonstrated that you have a serious impact on population. Once you move west, honestly, we are faced with the lack of data. When the first Europeans passed, for example, in the Bismarck archipelago, you have here D'Entrecasteaux, who says its population must be very numerous as the seashore is covered with habitation, surrounded by a great number of coconut trees. A century later, the mountain people of New Ireland are dying out, and it will be not be long before the last man disappears. And at the beginning of the 20th century, a conclusion is that nowhere in the Pacific is the phenomenon of the disappearance of the Aboriginal races more noticeable than in the islands of the Bismarck archipelago. The thing is, when you try to get data, well, you start getting data with the Germans at the very end of the 19th century. But what happened during at least the century before that? We haven't a clue. And when you push to the Solomons, who had two failed European settlement expeditions by Mendana in 1567 and 1595, it gets even worse. The Spanish stay there a couple of months. A Spanish boat was stranded. We know that thanks to Jim Allen, who is at the back of the room. And the Europeans probably stayed there for a couple of months or years, or we don't know the fate of these people. But what we clearly get is that when Europeans come back to this region at the end of the 18th century, the place doesn't look really the same as it was before. You have less people who are observed. And at the beginning of the 20th century, you have indication here of, on San Cristobal, you have a guy has shown the sites of 46 once flourishing villages, of which only 3 are now inhabited. So basically it's 95% again. Getting down south to Vanuatu, which was the case study of McArthur, anthropologists in the early 20th century had already identified that there was a clear problem. And Speiser proposed around 650,000 people for the archipelago. Harrison, a few decades later, did put forward the hypothesis that most of the depopulation was before the 1870s, so it means before we get any data. But once we get data, McArthur says, well, the population is around 100,000 or 70,000 people, not more. Here you have a lighter coverage published by Stewart of the density of sites that you have on Efate, showing that in an island which is with very low population density today, you had at one stage basically a completely occupied landscape. The pinnacle of McArthur's work was Anatia, where, to her, I suppose, discomfort, she demonstrated that depopulation was tragic, around 94%. But when Matthew Spriggs worked on the same island, and they put the archaeology into it, he raised even more the figure, getting to somewhere between 6,000 and maybe 10,000, even if I suppose that 10,000 is a figure that Matthew wouldn't really buy these days. But even a 6,000 figure makes it that you have 96% of the population dropping. When you get to Santo, you have the same problem as for the Solomon Islands. The first settlement, 3 weeks, in 1606 on Soto Island, Quiros says the place is densely populated. All this area is dotted with numerous hamlets from which fires and smoke can be seen everywhere, testifying of the large number of inhabitants. The next European crossing that area is Cook, who sees smoke everywhere. But 1 century later, basically the island is nearly devoid of population. Did depopulation start after Cook, who didn't land on Santo Island, or did it start before, so during Spanish time? And what did it bring in terms of demographic and social political changes? I'll finish with New Caledonia, which is kind of has still the strongest orthodox hypothesis related to McArthur's view. And this stems from Foster's when he stopped with Cook in 1774. He proposed at that time, having landed on the worst, one of the worst places you could think of on the northeast coast in Balad, he reckoned that probably there were no more than 50,000 people. And this number has been following up until French taking over, and still in the succeeding decades, before Europeans start to realize depopulation, what they say starting in the 1870s. So the orthodox idea is that New Caledonia would rank among the least cases of depopulation in the Pacific, somewhere between less than 40% and a little bit more than 60%. The problem is that it just doesn't work with the archaeology. This place is packed with huge sites. One of the categories being these amazing taro pondfield terracings that cover hundreds, if not thousands of hectares, and that just cannot work for a population, say, of between 3 and 5 inhabitants per square kilometer. It just does not make sense. So clearly we have for New Caledonia a need to kind of rise up the number of inhabitants. After this kind of tour of some examples in the Pacific, I would like to finish with an analysis with 3 key points. The first one being, and I suppose you have understood that was one of my interests. When did it start? Here you have a missionary from the LMS who says that it is certainly a fact which cannot be controverted that most of the diseases which have raged in the islands during my residence were there have been introduced by ships. And what renders this fact remarkable is that there might be no appearance of disease amongst the crew of the ship that conveyed this destructive importation, and that the infection was not communicated by any criminal conduct on the part of the crew, but by the common contact of ordinary intercourse. Another fact worthy of special notice is that first intercourse between Europeans and native is, I think, invariably attended with the introduction of fever, dysentery, or some other disease which carries off numbers of the people. This synthesizes the whole question about Pacific depopulation. I didn't put in capital first. It was the missionary who did write it in capital in his publication. And here we go back to the forgotten part of interactions between Europeans and Pacific Islanders, which start very early in the 16th century, with a series of real colonial projects. When Mendana comes to the Solomons in 1595, he arrives with a couple of ships, a couple of hundreds of people, you know, men, women, children, cows, plantations. I mean, it's just a colonial kind of effort with the idea of creating a European presence full-time. This is a list of contacts, most of them with direct contact between Magellan and Tasman. And you see that even leaving aside the Manila galleons, even leaving aside the Portuguese who were roaming around the place, but were not allowed to, so we don't have the data, it's quite a number of contacts that you have. Remember that the Manila galleons, I mean, did every year do a one-way return crossing of the Northern Pacific until the beginning of the 19th century. So you have had multiple, I mean, tens, hundreds of direct contact between Pacific Islanders and European during that time period. And not a single introduction of, not a single European disease. That would be most remarkable, I believe. And we know that there are introduction of diseases. And the first place where we got it, it's because the Europeans settled there, the Spanish missionaries, and it is Guam. We don't know what happens between Magellan and over a century and a half later, the arrival of the first missionaries. But what we know is that after the arrival of the missionaries, the population just collapses to a point where you don't have enough indigenous inhabitants on Guam, and the Spanish have to go to all the other islands, get all the inhabitants of the Northern Marianas to Guam, basically empty those islands, because the population is so low that they don't have enough working force. Another case is Futuna in the Central Pacific. Futuna was in contact with a Dutch expedition by Lemaire and Schutten in 1616. They stayed there for 2 weeks. We had the Dutch information clearly showing that you had sexual intercourse, exchange of cloth, partying, music. So clearly there was a very close relation during the 2 weeks. The next text that we have is 1837, when the French missionaries arrive. And basically what they see is that the main island of Futuna has only 900 inhabitants, and the smaller island of Alofi is empty. The recordings of the missionaries and work by Pat Couch and myself have evaluated the population at the arrival of the Dutch somewhere around between 8,000 to 9,000 people. What is interesting for Futuna is that Futuna is the only case study I know of where you have, just after the arrival of the missionaries, the demographic curve going up. In all the other cases, when they have the missionaries arriving, the demographic curve goes down. Here, when the missionaries arrive, the depopulation is already over. And I believe it's not a surprise that this is the first long contact with Europeans, and it's the case where you had a very early set of depopulation. So once you take Futuna in case, well, what happened elsewhere at these very early contacts? Eric Comte and Guillaume Moll have identified on Uahuka in the Marquesas Islands, first contact in 1595, that you have already empty valleys in the 18th century, indicating that probably there was something that happened after the contact with Mandela. What anthropologists have identified in Tonga, first contact in 1616 for the northern part, and by Tasman in 1643 in the southern part, is that you have a multiplication of chiefs that makes the structure becoming really complicated and complex. And this multiplication of chiefs is also seen in the 19th century in other parts of the Pacific. There seemed to be a relation between a crisis in the political system and hierarchies, and more people individually claiming rights to a political or customary position. And then you've got New Zealand, which has a very debated question about did something happen before James Cook or not? The contact with Tasman is very brief, ends up in some Dutch dying and some wounded sailors being brought to the coast. What is interesting is that in the following century, the tribe concerned by the encounter with Tasman was hurried by its enemies out of existence. What does that mean? Are we just in a local war kind of thing, or is that saying us something else? Knowing that archaeological studies have shown that there is at least one boat stranded, probably coming from Indonesia, so Dutch again, at the very beginning or very end of the 17th century, very beginning of the 18th century. The wreck has been found just north of Auckland. So you can imagine that probably you had Europeans that were saved and were there over 60 years before first contact. Rapa Nui is, of course, another case. When James Cook comes, he reckons that you don't have more than 700 people. And the British say, how did the people raise all these statues? Doesn't make sense. Knowing that first contact was in 1722, again by the Dutch. And when they went on the shore, clearly you had a much larger population than the one that Cook saw. So we have the possibility that part of the depopulation started in some places of the Pacific well before the end of the 18th century. The second question is, what's the magnitude of this depopulation? Here on the right, you have the main diseases that were identified by Europeans during the 19th century. And you see that you've got a fairly large variety of diseases that impacted the population. I've worked on 52 case studies, and I've ended up with this graph. You compare it to the table I had presented you a bit earlier on, based on the work of Norma McArthur, and you realize that complete disagreement. Knowing that for most of these cases, I really took kind of a fairly conservative data. What is interesting is this group here. Every single case of this low depopulation is characterized by numbers that are in terms of density of occupation that are really low. And this was a surprise to me, because I ended up with a graph like this one, where you get from 200 people per square kilometer to 3 people per square kilometer. The difference is absolutely huge. And more interestingly, when you compare Polynesia and Micronesia to Melanesia, you end up with a real high population density, somewhere between 50 and 100 to make it simple. While in island Melanesia, it drops to between 25 and sometimes less than 10. What is this telling us? For me, it's just telling us that all the data we have on island Melanesia is probably well after first cycle of depopulation. So we're missing a large part of the history of depopulation in island Melanesia, contrary to Polynesia and parts of Micronesia. When I started working on depopulation 30 years ago, I had a very excited archaeological challenge. And so I got really into what was needed in terms of archaeological research. But I realized moving forward that what we are talking about is just horrible. It's just terrible. Which means that it was not only about depopulation, it's about a crash in a number of, basics of a culture and identity. I just want to struggle the point on 3 points. The first one relates to women. Over and over again in the notebooks, in the sailors, the first thing that Europeans want when they get on shore is women. And in some places, people are keen to make it happen. In other places, people are more reluctant. But you see that this part of the intercourse between Europeans and Pacific Islanders through women has a devastating effect on the demography. Introduction of sexual diseases makes it that in a few generations, you have in places something like half of the couples who are unfertile. So even if it's not direct depopulation because of influenza or things like that, it's just that people are not able to regain the number of babies. And one of the most unexpected example was the Shortlanders just south of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, where Bailey Smith gives an example from around the turn of the 20th century, explaining that you had so few children that the Shortlanders would go to southern Bougainville to basically buy children to kind of hopefully continue part of their living. The other is, of course, political disruption. When you've got chiefs dying like everybody else, when you've got the sons of the chiefs dying, how do you follow up in terms of political stability? And what is very clear in the writings of the 19th century is that basically the entire Pacific during the first half of the 19th century, the entire Pacific is at war. Everywhere you have wars. Getting from Hawaii to Tahiti to Tonga to Fiji to the Solomons, it's people are fighting. And I guess that part of this fighting is because you have a real crisis in terms of successions related to high-ranking chiefs and aliki. Which gets me back to Melanesia. The idea is that Melanesian political systems function around big men. So now the complex hierarchies are supposed to be Polynesians, and simple big man systems are supposed to be Melanesians. But these Melanesian systems are studied at the very end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century in a lot of places. And new analysis of some of them clearly shows up that 40, 50 years before, you had chiefdoms in these areas. I am not saying that all the big man systems are the result of depopulation. You had places where people have been functioning as on big man systems for a very long time. But it appears fairly clear that in a number of cases, the big man system, to make it really broad, was a response to demographic crash, political turmoil, and trying to, you know, when you had 100 people in one place and you have only 5 people left, I mean, you cannot continue functioning as it was before. The last point is that everywhere, death and diseases is related to magic, is related to ancestors, is related to the invisible. And the Pacific Islanders realized very quickly that Europeans were not dying. It was just them who were dying. And so it probably brought, in terms of symbolics, a fear, profound crisis related to their own beliefs and view of the world, to make it simple. And you would ask, how did missionaries succeed so quickly to convert a fairly large part of the Pacific? Well, the conversion is probably first led by the belief of some of the missionaries, at least. This quote is here, however. that people are dying because of the infinite wisdom of God, to show that this is the real faith. But the relation between missionary arrival and death was also identified by Pacific Islanders in different ways depending on where you were. And I found the example of the Tongans really interesting, because they thought that because the LMS missionaries were just doing their ceremonies in a closed fale and didn't let the Tongans assist to the ceremonies, they thought that, well, missionaries are bringing diseases, are doing these sacred magical things. Well, the scope is to kill all the Tongans so that Britain can take over the land of the Tongans. Where do we go from here? Probably the first conclusion is that depopulation in the Pacific was very strong and was traumatizing to Pacific Islanders. I've done with my 52 case studies, I've done a calculation, each island being one case, I get to 79.5 minimum depopulation. If I take the land surface, it gets to 87.5 depopulation minimum. Clearly, depopulation started with the introduction of epidemics. Clearly, epidemics led to political, social crisis. But depopulation was also driven by all sorts of different other media. That is not only through diseases. You've got diseases, especially STD, related to infertility, but you have also everywhere use of bad alcohol that really gets onto the health of the islanders. And in some places, you've got blackbirding, you've got colonial wars. And so you've got a very a succession of different reasons why you have this reef depopulation. You have understood that one of my main questions is, what do we call first contact, especially in island Melanesia? Here, I've taken the example of Vanuatu. This here is for a population of 700,000 people in Vanuatu, which was proposed by Cook a number of years ago. And here is the estimates of population at first contact for a variety of islands. You see that every single island is lower than this case of 700,000. Luckily for us, we have today a number of genetic data that can help us get some more clear idea demonstrating this depopulation. I take the case study of Samoa, where the DNA study shows a kind of bottleneck process about 300 years ago, which gets, of course, completely at odds with the idea of Norma McArthur, showing that there was indeed a very severe depopulation in Samoa, which the LiDAR data on Samoa are slowly showing also. Clearly, we need transdisciplinary collaborations to really get forward. Archaeologists, just by themselves, will not come up with the entire picture. Historical demographers, anthropologists, neither. So the only way forward is really a collaboration between these different fields of expertise to be able to get a new picture of Pacific demography in the decade to come. This is what you get when you're just measuring in the field. This is what you get when you start using LiDAR. And it's clear that LiDAR is the way forward. I mean, it's a fantastic tool. I would like to finish on a positive note. It's that at the beginning of the 20th century, Europeans thought that there was a kind of collective suicide of especially Melanesians that were so oppressed by the white people that basically women didn't want to do babies anymore, and that there had been a choice of basically disappearing. Well, even in the 1930s, people in Europe, Europeans realized that clearly there was everywhere population going up. And this was through a complete change of women's pregnancy. Probably before European contact, women would have in the Pacific maybe 2-3 children per generation. When you look just after World War II, and in some places even before, you have women having 10, 15, sometimes 20 children during their lifetime. So clearly you have a major importance of the, don't know what the right word in English is, but of the what women have been bringing to Pacific revitalization over the 20th century. And that makes it that all the Pacific Islanders, everywhere you go, they are still there. Thank you very much.